mention Manasseh and Ephraim. When they do the gates, they do Joseph. So there's 13 tribes in the first section of that, and there's 12 in the gates. I don't know why or how they choose to do that, but it's just odd.
Yeah, half the time we're a baker's dozen instead of a dozen. All right, Nancy had one in the back.
I have another comment, but
Okay.
Why does Joseph's two sons get double? Anyways,
Well,
I guess I should have asked that months ago.
That's kind of what Terry was just pointing out too, right? That's why there's 12 or 13. So it's not consistently it's not consistently double, like you said. Or I don't know. I'm kind of confused by that too.
When they came into the land, they each got their own portion of land.
And so that's the part that Terry was pointing out is they did get their portion, but then when we go to she was talking about the gates, naming the gates, they only get one labeled there for them. Joseph, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't have a good answer for that. I don't really understand.
Well, my comment was probably this river you were talking about,
Yeah.
but it says, so maybe it would be figuratively, maybe it'll be actual. The water flows toward the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah and enters the sea, and this says it's the Dead Sea. Mm-hmm. And the Dead Sea is still dead, right? I mean, it's still dead, right? There's no living thing in there. It's just salt, and then it says that it's going to be refreshed, and everything will grow there, and the fishermen will stand by the sea, and they'll be able to fish in the Dead Sea.
Because how we would define it like stagnant, that kind of dead. Of chapter 48 or 47?
24th, yeah. I think it's. Well, it says. This water flows toward the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah and enters the sea. And then it says 2, and I go down here, and 2 says that is the Dead Sea.
I've got that same.
When the water flows into the sea, the water will become fresh, and wherever the river goes, every living creature that swarms will live. And then it goes over here, and it says they can fish in it. Its fish will be of very many kinds, like the fish of the Great Sea, which is the Mediterranean Sea. So I'm just wondering if that's a prophecy. Will it really happen? Will the Dead Sea actually become alive again after, Sodom and Gomorrah? I guess that's when it was created. That's why I said,
is this figurative or is this literal?
Right,
and
right.
I like Terry's answer of, because I would think, yeah. And then you would think, what Nancy's pointing out, if it was literally refreshing the Dead Sea, that would have happened at the point after the temple being built, right? And so here we are, so much time passed since
thousands
then.
of years.
And, yeah,
it's still
thousands of years. Go for it, Courtney. Just go grab your microphone.
I had. Did you? Well, I have one more thing in Ezekiel. I don't know. I just have this where. And the name of the city from that time on shall be the Lord is there. Mm-hmm. Anybody explain that to me? What does that mean?
That's in 47 as well, or?
That is in 48, I believe. 48, 35. The Lord. Maybe it was.
Yeah. So the name of the city. So we get all these details again. The circumference of the city shall be 18,000 cubits, and the name of the city from that time on shall be. The Lord is there. And anybody got their Hebrew interlinear open? Because that we could probably find what the city's actually called. Because we got the, what's that?
And see if it's there.
You guys want me to look?
Yeah, please. It's like
I should have looked at my new thing then.
Yeah, I was gonna say you got that big fancy.
I was so excited about getting to Daniel, I had to keep reading. I got all the way.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about Daniel too, to be honest.
I had to draw pictures of the dream.
All right, Ezekiel 48. Sorry, I'm slow today, apparently. It is Yahweh. Yep. So,
with lines.
yeah. So that would be the Lord, right? The Lord. So the city of the Lord. And then there is also a adjective before that, which is there. There is the Lord. So that's where we get that little breakdown for you. So anyway, interesting. Couldn't tell you. Go for it, Courtney. I thought maybe I could uncover it, but I didn't. So
You can take this or leave it. So, I mean, there's just so much prophecy, and I would say prophecy that is not yet fulfilled in the Old Testament, such as Jesus as a warrior. There was a reason they thought the Messiah was going to be a warrior king, because there's prophecies about that, in my opinion, have not yet been fulfilled. And I don't know how that's going to work, and who knows, Revelation might be a roller coaster, but...
well, and we see a little more of a warrior stance when he returns. I mean,
yeah. And then also, I think even if I'm not saying don't try, but even if we could fully get a grip on these prophecies, I think we'd still end up like the apostles did, with really wonky expectations and not understanding even when Jesus says it plain to our face, you know? He's like, I will die. And they were like, no way.
No. Yeah, that's true.
And for me, that's comforting. I know that might not be for everybody else, but to be like, oh, I'm never really going to get it. And it's not going to matter. Jesus is not going to be like, you want to go to heaven? Did you understand what I was meaning when I talked about the Dead Sea? I'll be like, no.
Brenda had a comment over
Okay.
here too next, by the way. Absolutely.
I consider it all fulfilled in Christ, but to me, all of this, the temple, to me, is a church. If you look at the measurements, if you look at everything, it was never built that way. To me, it's a church. It's showing the layers of the church. It's showing that each part is very significant. One part is not more important than another part. And it shows the river flowing through is Christ flowing through the church. And the church is where God is, where the Lord is, where Yahweh is dwelling, is in the church. At least that's the way, to me, it all comes together.
Yeah.
If I consider it that way, to me.
I like that too, because that's obviously the symbolism of like the river, and the name that Nancy just pointed out at the end. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. All right, I'm excited about Daniel, so I'm going to talk about Daniel you have something else on Ezekiel? Yeah, that's what Brenda was pointing us to. All right, I'm excited about Daniel, mainly because we have been in, the kind of the same form of prophet books for a while. Daniel's so much different and very enjoyable. So we start off Daniel. We get to look at the people, the main characters, right, are these boys that are captives, for a lack of a better word, from where? Judah, right? So we're shifting a little bit here, but these are Judah boys who are under the rule of Babylon and King Nebuchadnezzar, right? Nebuchadnezzar, as Grandma pointed out as she's been reading this here. Nebuchadnezzar. And so part of these captives are these boys that we know, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, which most people know them in the story of the names the king gives them, the Babylonian names, right? Shadi, and Abed, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I love the names in Daniel, okay? I just have fun with that. So we start this story off with them being selected by the king to basically go through the apprenticeship program for years, right? 3? Was it 3 years? 3 years, and we start the story there with Daniel and his buddies that are all together, and probably one of the less famous stories of Daniel, actually, is here at the beginning, but it's a really important one, right? The first thing we see is all about the king's food, and this is not about the food as much as it's about serving the Lord versus serving the king, right? Why did they not want to partake in the king's food? Exactly, right? Why did they not want to partake in the king's food? It was the king's food. It was, you get this imagery of it being the royal fattening, you kind of get all of this. What did they choose instead? Vegetables, right? And that's like the opposite picture of king's opulence, right? If I was a king, I wouldn't have a whole lot of vegetables around my palace either, right? But Daniel forefronts to the king's headmaster watching them, right? They want to eat what the Lord has given them, and that's vegetables, and not what the king is trying to give them. And so he puts them to the test. He says, he's gonna kill me if I let you eat only vegetables and you look like a scrawny little boy. Daniel convinces him to say, yeah, give us 10 days, right? 10 days to put it to the test, and after 10 days, eat your vegetables, right? They were more strong than all the other boys who had been eating the king's food. And so this relationship between Daniel and the people that are ruling over him is flourishing while he's trusting in God. Sometimes we think that has to be opposites. That's not the case in the beginning of this Daniel story, right? So they are excelling not only in their health, but you might also notice there in the first chapter that they are doing the best in the schooling as well. They come out, they excel in their training. Their education was a big part of that, right? So they find favor with the king because they are top of the class, healthiest boys, Daniel and his friends. But also, Daniel, the reason this whole book is called Daniel, he's kind of the main character here, right? He's got some gifts from God. And one of those gifts is dream interpretation. And all of the wise men or the magistrate, all of the magicians for the king, they get it really rough because the king has a dream that he wants explained. And I thought it was hilarious. No details, right? He's like, well, if you can really tell me my dream, what it means, tell me what it was. Or else I'll kill you and all your family. Whoa, right? But they can't do that. And so they are ordered to be executed. That's just kings, right? That's just kings. And so the wise man can't do that. But Daniel and his friends are kind of thrown into that situation as well. And so Daniel seeks God's mercy and actually receives the interpretation without ever being told what the dream was from the king, from God. I think we just need to recognize this is all from God. This is God's work here. And so kind of where we end up is, again, Daniel and his friends even have a higher status and more honor from the king, and it's because of God and it's pointing to God this entire time so far. So that's as far as we went in the story. That's just the first couple of chapters of Daniel, but that's where we're at with Daniel. What comments did you guys have? I kind of gave you the outline there. Dennis has got one back there.
Much as God hates all them false religions and everything, why did wonderful Daniel call for sparing them after they messed up with they couldn't perform when it came to interpreting the dream or even saying what it was, and he did. They're going to kill him. The king was going to kill him. And Daniel called for their life to be saved.
Yeah.
I'm just really curious why.
You want to swap those microphones for me? Well, they were going to kill Daniel and the other guys. But I think what Dennis is pointing out, he calls for the king to spare them. Is that what you're pointing out? Yeah. No, you're right there at the right point.
Usually you would think that all of those magicians and blah, blah, blah would have been grateful.
Yeah.
Guess they forgot back in Cyrus time, Cyrus time.
Well, and he also points, through that, he points to God again, straight to Nebuchadnezzar's face, right? That sounds mean, but straight to Nebuchadnezzar's face. Let me read 27 and 28. Daniel answered the king and said, "No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in bed are these." And then he goes in to say it, right? he straight off points to God with everything he does. I think that's the most important thing through the theme of all of Daniel, right? I know we're not there yet, but when the fiery furnace happens, what's the point of all of that? Well, it's kind of like the grand finale when there's an extra person walking in the furnace, right? It's not a physical being, it's a spiritual being. And so I think all of Daniel, and this is tying in kind of to Dennis's, I kind of went off on a different tangent here. The entire theme of Daniel is pointing that whatever Daniel and his friends do, they're pointing to God. And right now, Nebuchadnezzar is actually respecting that, saving them. Brenda and then Terry?
One of the things to me is we live in most generations have lived in a very rebellious times. And to me, this shows that Daniel and his friends was respecting the government that had taken them captive as very young boys. Mm-hmm. And they were respecting them. They weren't rebellious. They weren't revolting. They were doing the best that they could to serve God and to glorify God in their captivity. And part of it was that Daniel asked permission for the food. He didn't rebel and say, I'm not going to eat your food. He asked permission. We get rebellious and revolt, and we don't try to do things God's way. And that's what I love about Daniel. He was, to me, a mediator. He could negotiate. He pled for these guys' lives. To me, he really was a servant of God, I guess.
Absolutely. Daniel is such a great example of something we have a really hard time doing that Brenda's pointing out. Terry and then my mom. So we respect the country, the authority, even when it's against God. How do we navigate that, right? Daniel's a great example of how we navigate that. He didn't just spit in their face and say, God told me not to. He, like you said, he asked for permission, put God to the test to prove it, really, right? It was God that was the vegetable test, not Daniel. And that's true with the dream interpretation too, right? In God's hands, not Daniel, even though it was kind of rebellious in the most respectful way. That is so hard to do. I constantly ask questions about how do you do that thing? That's tough. Daniel's a great example. Terry, Christine, and then we'll come back to Nancy.
I think we need to remember too that in most of these times, food would have been offered to gods. Mm-hmm. And the food that would have been offered to gods would be meat and grain and wine. At least everything in the Old Testament that we read says that kind of thing. So it's very possible that he didn't want to eat the food that had already been offered to other gods. But what I think is really interesting is that Nebuchadnezzar falls before Daniel and he says, God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries. And in the next chapter, he builds a graven image and he throws people into a furnace for not worshiping that image. So did he think that Daniel's God was just, a God that revealed dreams? They had gods for everything. Mm-hmm. So was he thinking Daniel's God was a little god? It's just kind of interesting that he goes from your God is the God of gods and a reveal of mysteries, and oh, by the way, now you have to worship me.
It's super interesting, but also totally human, right? We want to pretend like we don't do that sort of thing. We don't want to do that thing, but humans do that sort of thing all the time, right? I trust God to provide. Let me worship my bank account. Well, we kind of do that. We make graven images, maybe not to the same caliber that we see the display of Nebuchadnezzar, but he's kind of human in that way. But yeah, he's obviously not quite wrapped his head around the almighty, powerful ruler of all God if he goes in the next chapter and decides, well, I'm equal with that. Let's go build the biggest thing that's ever been built worship-wise. Christine.
So we've read already in this Bible earlier this year how God placed Nebuchadnezzar. He used him. He purposed Nebuchadnezzar to come take over the 12 tribes, right?
Yeah.
Particularly taking them into captive, Judah. And so, even when we have authorities that are, in our minds, very evil, that doesn't mean God didn't put them there on purpose.
To do something.
To
even
do
when
something.
we can't see it. Yeah, absolutely. All right, Nancy definitely. Emily. Then I'm sorry, Nancy. We're getting there.
I'll be quick. Something that I really appreciate about the whole book of Daniel in general is just that it's a really good example for us to see how we don't always know. We don't know what God is doing. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't see the big picture. And that happens in Daniel several different times. So maybe here at the beginning with this dream, like Daniel's probably like, I don't know why I know this, but I do. And that's maybe laying some groundwork for some big things that happen later. I mean, in the furnace, which I know we're not there yet, but in the furnace.
Daniel's short, so we'll be there next
Yeah.
week.
I'm sure that they were asking and begging God to change their circumstances. And we do that all the time. And sometimes God says no. And he says, nope, you're going to walk through this. But when you think about it, because of their experience in the furnace, an entire nation knew about God, had that opportunity. And so there are things in our lives where we're asking God to change our circumstances, and he doesn't, and that's frustrating, but maybe something big is going to happen out of that. Or maybe not, and that's maybe later. Who knows?
Well, big we don't see.
Right.
Yeah. We tend to forget that because what you're talking about for us is prayer, right? God answers prayer. It's either yes, no, or later, right? And sometimes we're like, he can only answer yes. There was a hilarious video a couple weeks ago. If you guys, I don't know. It was like some kid saying, he was pretending to be a kid. He was a full-grown adult. But God doesn't answer prayers. And he's like, yeah, he does. And he's like, what do you mean? Well, I prayed for this, and he didn't give it. Well, that means it was no. And he's like, well, what does that mean? And he's like, the guy's eating a burrito, and he's like, I prayed for a burrito. And he's like, no, this is my burrito. So God's answering you no. And it's just hilarious. So anyway, I'll find it for you guys. I can't tell you videos. That's a dumb thing to do. All right, Nancy, let's go for
Well,
it.
it was just a small thing, because I thought to myself, well, why don't they want to eat the king's food? But then I thought, well, maybe they wanted to give glory to God instead of glory to the king.
Yes. And that's kind of what Terry was getting us on. The cultural backing is there. We don't know for sure in the text, but the cultural backing is there. This would be worshiping not only the king, but other gods, right? And so all of the glory now points back to God, and they're stronger. Courtney.
I got 2 jokes.
Oof.
Isn't it funny how often God uses vegetables to teach us about himself?
Like
And-
veggies.
I didn't say they were good jokes. That was a VeggieTales reference.
Okay, I thought so.
And then
One less what?
one
One
last
less-
plug. And then oh yeah,
Go for
there
it.
you go, there you go. And then I think it's funny. It's a little bit common nowadays to hear someone say, "Oh, I'm going to do a Daniel fast," and that's like an oxymoron. It means you're going to eat vegetables and water.
Yeah.
But that's not a fast.
That's not
like,
a fast. That's a diet, a Daniel diet.
A Daniel diet.
Daniel diet.
All right, you can move on to Peter now.
All right, Brenda's got one back there in the corner. She's obviously still on Daniel, so that's good. We're doing all right. The New Testament's much shorter amount of content usually.
I'm sorry. The food for the Jews was very specific about the way it was prepared. They had to bleed the animals in a very certain way. Mm-hmm. They could not process vegetables and beef or meat together. They had separate kitchens for vegetables and a separate kitchen for meats. It was very specific for the Jewish diet.
Yes, absolutely. No stir fry for them. They were separate. All right. We'll talk about New Testament a little bit because we actually read a lot in James. We read about equal amounts of James and 1 Peter this week. But James it's kind of hard. We're kind of like belittling it. There's so much good in James. So if you hit the new year and you don't want to do something this big again, just start off with James and see, learn some stuff. I love James. Anyway, chapter 2 is where we picked up in James. Faith is important, but faith without doing anything about it is is worthless, right? That's what James is saying in chapter 2. That is so important for us to continue to know and work on today. Empty words are empty if you don't put action behind them, right? And so for our faith walk today, faith and works are connected. And those are sometimes dangerous terms because people want to make them mean other things they don't mean. It means live out your Christianity, live out your faith, right? James kind of gives us ways that we can do that, and that's the challenging part of James, is there's all these practical things. James in chapter 3 talks about taming the tongue. And we like to say, oh man, this is a great little sermon. Harold, you should give a sermon out of James chapter 3 about why you can't say this word or that word that are 4 letters or 5 letters. This is about the tongue. This is about what you say, right? All the words. The building up or tearing down, we all wrestle with that each and every day in and day out, right? Wisdom and humility come out of the same mouth as stupidity and pride. That doesn't work so well, right? And so all of this is how you speak, not just the words that you say, how you speak. Chapter 4, again, something we get to work on to this day, very practical. Conflicts between fellow Christians. Never had any of those today yet. Yesterday was a different day. Anyway, but he encourages us to be patient and have endurance. And no matter what we're doing, to be kind and shine the light, right? That's what we're supposed to be doing. He doesn't say they won't come. He doesn't say to squash the quarrels. He says they will exist. You have a higher goal of what you're doing, right? Again, James is super, super practical. James chapter 5. Don't be greedy. Again, super practical. Don't be greedy and take pride in your riches. Don't mistreat others. Show them respect. All of these things that we get to practice each and every day. Practice patience, even when the patience is in the middle of suffering. This is probably the most famous piece of James, right? Because we deal with suffering all the time. But we got to practice patience for what God's doing. And he actually, James uses the example of the prophets suffering for a long time. We suffered a long time reading the prophets. Just imagine all of the years they were trying to convince the people to actually serve the God that they professed they were. That's what James is pointing to. And then the end of chapter 5 is all about prayer. And all of this is kind of in the box that we had a sermon about probably about a year ago of God's kind of wisdom. Proverbs and James can be really linked there. But prayer to God, the hope that we have in resurrection, just encouragement for Christians of what we are walking towards. So that's James. That's my quick and simple of James. You guys got any final, the last half of James comments, I should say? Okay, Dennis and Nan, they were just waiting to make sure nobody else.
Nope, I hear it. Never mind.
The 4:11, speak not evil one against another, brethren. He that speaketh evil of his brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. And he goes on. But I have seen that you're judging. You're judging. Anytime somebody says something about another Christian or anybody, you're judging. In other words, nobody can say nothing bad or negative or corrective or anything about anybody, or they're judging. And so
Cultural slice.
all a Christian can talk about, like when he's praying, I guess, is about himself and Jesus. Because if he talks about anybody else, at least in the least bit negative, he's judging. And you get that slapped at you all the time if you try to tell somebody they're doing something wrong. And yet I see Paul and Peter and Moses and all of them laying it to people that are doing wrong. And are we supposed to copy Paul like he says 4 times, imitate me because I imitate Christ? Or are we supposed to just go around not say nothing about anybody that's doing something because we might be judging? How do we define between judging and this loving, constructive criticism?
Yeah, we have a really cultural slice right now. Everything's judging is what Dennis was pointing out. and it doesn't mean what it means biblically, right? Judging is not this terrible thing that our culture makes it out to be. In fact, I think it was on Wednesday, you all that were here with me Wednesday, I think we were talking about, we are actually literally called to judge our brothers and sisters in Christ and then help them correct sin, right? Go to them and tell them they're sinning. Help them out. That's all judging. That's what, you can't know if somebody's sinning if you're not judging that they're sinning, right? And so I think the most powerful part here is the doing that goes along with the judging is a bad word in our culture, right? The doing that goes along with the judging. A lot of your prayers are about yourself, right? And when they're about the brother, they're also kind of about yourself half the time. And so they play hand in hand. That's my perspective on it. But our culture just has defined judging so wrong. Judging is just basically making a discernment call. That's all it is, right? And we have made it like an enemy thing. I see it, Nancy. Go for it.
Well, I wasn't going to talk about this, but I think that when people say "Thou shalt not judge," they want to sin in peace. They don't want to be called out. And I have a whole bunch of verses about judging, but in what Ezekiel was told, if you do not tell the wicked that they are being wicked and they perish, you will be accountable. So when we point out something to somebody else, it's not just their soul we're worried about, we're also worried about our souls. So it's not just them. And there's many verses. Matthew 7:1-6, Jesus teaches us how to judge. John 7:24, Jesus commands us to judge. 1 Corinthians 2:15-16, judging is the character of being spiritual. 1 Corinthians 5:12-13, we are to judge those in the church. 1 Corinthians 6:5, we are to judge matters between brothers. 1 Corinthians 14:28, we are to judge preaching. 2 Corinthians 11:4, we are to judge doctrine and teaching. Anyways,
we're going to talk about that in the
but
sermon
I'm just
a little
saying,
bit today, too, actually.
that just drives me crazy, and it's because they want to sin in peace. They don't want to be called out for it.
Well, and it's so difficult because you just throw that word in our culture right now. We are not good at understanding it. And as we come across the New Testament, like Nancy's pointing out, the shift goes a lot from, like, the prophets were called to get, these are people of God that they're supposed to be correcting, right? And that is actually true for us in the New Testament too. We just kind of forget the prophets were for the people of God. And so we have to remember that the bulk of the judging we're to be doing, even though it's a naughty word, the bulk of the judging is between believers, right? Yeah. We don't like that. We don't like that. Oftentimes it's much more comfortable to go judge somebody who's a sinner on a certain sin. That's God's, right? I mean, we can try and help them, be like, hey, man, I see that this thing you're doing is killing your life. I can help you. But what we got a lot of work to do on helping each other out is the judging we're talking about. All right, Courtney, and then I think some other people. Emily?
All right.
Sorry.
That was great. That was very comprehensive. Y'all have done a great job. I'm just going to continue to beat the horse. I don't know if it's dead or not, but yeah, I mean, there's two definitions for judging. There's two ways we can use it. Think of like a competition. We both submit apple pies, and the judge will determine which one is better than the other. So one type of judging is judging that something is better than the other, whereas the other type is judging in a discernment way, in discerning what is just using facts, judging that this is correct and this is incorrect. And I personally believe that we're called to the second type, because if we ever take on the air of I am better than you, not necessarily my way is right and your way is wrong, that's discernment, but I am better than you, which is, it's easy to do. And I think that's why there's so many warnings about judging with hypocrisy. Remove that plank from your eye because they've got a speck compared to you, it's like, and I think that's metaphorical, that it's a lot easier. My problems are supposed to be a lot bigger to me.
Yeah, which is kind of what James is saying too about the obeying.
Yeah, don't be hypocrite.
Obeying being the first part, the greatest part right here.
I'm all for that we can discern, we can judge. And I understand why the world hates it a little when people are holding up signs that say, God hates you. God doesn't hate you. God hates your sin.
Right, and that was the the other part that we are much more comfortable doing.
And so, I mean, I do get that it's very frustrating when people throw that in your face, but still having a heart for them, and that does not mean withholding the truth, but having that heart that I understand why you're hurt by this, but clarifying, this is about discernment and it's about submitting to God, and that's all I can think of.
Emily up here.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh.
Judging and judgmental. Judge
Yes.
in our culture right now means that you're judgmental.
And
right?
here's the kicker, to sum it all up, just check your heart. Just constantly be checking your heart.
Check your actions too, according to James. I'll let Emily have hers. Go for it.
I mean, I'm basically just going to say what they've all been saying, but in our society, there's judging, but in the faith, we need to be holding each other accountable. So, because that's essential for our spiritual health. And so we need to be willing to say to others or say to ourselves, like, hey, this is not Christ-like. This is going to lead you down a path that will hurt you, that will hurt others, that will hurt God. Like, that's not okay. And that's in a spirit of accountability. And I mean, once again, you need to be checking your heart and make sure that if you are holding someone accountable, like, you're also holding yourself accountable and vice versa. But that's not the same as our societal understanding of the term judgment or judgmental, because we're holding each other accountable, and those are two different things.
And it's very, very difficult. I was kind of hoping somebody in here would disagree, because it's so permeated into us. That's the definition of judge. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to get free of, because we still do it. We still are like, you can't judge me. Well, actually, everybody in this room kind of can, right? And so we struggle through that. Anybody else in James? All right, Terry will be our last James comment, because I want to hit us on 1 Peter just a little bit. And I should be done right now, but that's okay.
It's not a comment, it's a question.
Uh-oh.
4:7. Submit yourself then to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Is it ever right to flee from the devil?
Well, would Jesus not have given us the example of at least telling the devil to flee? Is that the same thing or different? I don't know. Terry always asks the questions that I can't give an answer to. And he said, get behind me, Satan, right? That's kind of the example I was thinking of. But go for it.
Isn't there a verse that talks about flee from sin?
Yeah. But is that the same?
Let me Google it really quick.
All right. We have -5 minutes, so I'm going to give us, I'm sorry. -5 minutes. So Peter, we've talked about 1 Peter quite a bit here recently. Remember, it's written to the dispersed people in different nations. So that's kind of an important piece to think here. But the overall theme as we get going is we are one in Christ. We have this in common. We are living stones with Christ. We are built on him as the cornerstone, living stones of a temple. All of these things are pretty cool imagery of, we were just talking about the temple dimensions and stuff like that. Brendan's like, this is the church. This is definitely the church, living stones. These are people, all built on the cornerstone of Christ. And so we have a job to do. We should desire more than just pointless things. We should desire the pureness and the meat of the Word, and we should go out and encourage society and submit to authority and endure suffering and do all of these things in the eyes of others so that they can see that we are those living stones. Some of those ways that we can do that, like I said, chapter 4, suffering for Christ or suffering because of your faith. That's a valuable part. Living for God rather than for self. That's a valuable part. Chapter 3, having good relationships both in and out of the church. There's parts about wives and husbands and children, and all of that is all in 1 Peter. And being persecuted with gentleness and respect. That just seems like a oxymoron sentence to us. But being persecuted with gentleness and respect and trusting that God will protect us. So there's lots of good stuff in 1 Peter. We'll probably talk about 1 Peter actually next week. I'm sorry. I wondered about it. I wondered about making notes yesterday. I was like, I don't know. We got a lot. So you have permission to go all the way back to 1 Peter chapter 1 next week.
Just to let everybody know, 1 Peter is the topic of the Winter Rendezvous
And Cody. Information's on the bulletin board, up tall. Yeah. All right, guys, I will see you all in a minute. Thank you for all your comments. I don't know.
Do I have like a electromagnetic pulse coming in my body?
Maybe.
My spirit is willing, but my flesh is so weak, like the fire.